shame and guilt are oftentimes a failure to, or a assuming that you are not what you actually are supposed to be. And that's where the Christian advantage of figuring out where our actual identity comes from helps eliminate some of that shame in the whole concept. Because if my primary identity is a redeemed child of God, no mistake I make can take that away. No failure, whether it's moral or career oriented or relational, no failure can jeopardize the status of being a redeemed child, so that gives you emotional wellness by making sure your identity is rooted in the right spot as a Christian.
That is James Hein, and this is the Well Mind Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Coles. The Well Mind is a space for meaningful conversations about a broad range of wellness-related topics. I want to mention a few things before we jump into my conversation with James. First, I want to share a success with you. Over the past 2 years, I've been working with Bethany Lutheran College to design, develop, and implement a graduate program in clinical mental health counseling. From time to time, I've talked about that here on the podcast. Some of my guests have been aware or involved in different capacities in that process. And I think I've shared that earlier this year we gained accreditation and were approved to launch the program. Well, all of that started a cascade of activity in order to get the program into a position to be able to welcome our first cohort of students. Well, it's all come together, and we're offering our first 2 courses this summer as a kind of soft launch. And then we'll be rolling out the full program this fall. We already have a number of students enrolled in classes this summer, and we're actively accepting and reviewing applications for the fall. It's been a very exciting time, to say the least. And when I take a moment to step back, which I do try and do, I really just marvel at how God has been and continues to bless this whole process. So I also want to mention that in an upcoming episode, I'll be sitting down with Dr. Karina Clennon for a chat. She started on April 1st as the second faculty member for the program, and she brings a wealth of knowledge and experience. And I'm just glad I'm not a one-man band anymore. So it's great to have Dr. Clennon with me, and so we're just going to sit down and have a conversation about some of the professional areas that she has experience in and can share with us. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you do as well. Next, I want to apologize for only getting 1 episode out in May. I had an episode planned, but it fell through, and I didn't have the time to get something else set up. So that's the first time that has happened. So hopefully that's not a recurring issue, but that's just the reality of life. Things don't always work out the way we had intended them to. So sorry about that, but we're back on track here. So lastly, I'm planning a new kind of episode for the Well Mind. I'm planning to do a question and answer episode in one of the coming months. And I did something like this for the live podcast on college student mental health earlier this year. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed hearing from listeners. I enjoyed having that engagement and interaction. So in this Q&A that I'm planning, I'm not going to do that live like I did the college student one. But I am inviting all of my listeners to submit your wellness-related questions. Submit them to the podcast email. That's thewellmind, all one word, @blc.edu. Again, that's thewellmind, all one word, @blc.edu. I'll be accepting submissions over the coming few weeks, just collecting them, going through them, trying to see which ones match up, what themes are kind of there, and then I'm going to record an episode addressing as many as I can. Depending upon the, topics or the focus of some of the questions, I'll either record that with somebody or possibly even reach out to a few different people and have them also kind of give some of their answers to your questions. And then I'll do my best to answer them as well. So I'm not putting any specific guidelines on the questions other than just wanting them to be focused around supporting your wellness. So that's it, I think, for my updates. So let's get into my conversation with James. He was my guest back in episode 3 of the podcast, which, as an aside, is one of the most played episodes of the whole podcast. I didn't tell him that, of course, but it's true. It continues to get played. I think there's just a thirst for more topics, more ideas around spiritual wellness. So I asked him to come back on the show. And in this instance, we take that conversation of spiritual wellness and extend it and in some ways deepen it, because we end up focusing specifically on a few themes and topics related to suffering. And we really explore many different facets of suffering in terms of how it impacts our life, our overall wellness, and our relationships. And maybe this sounds a little counterintuitive to be talking about suffering on a wellness podcast, but I think you'll understand once you get into the episode. Our discussion is pretty wide-ranging, actually. We touch on experiences of personal guilt and shame, themes of grief and loss, even our search for meaning and purpose in this life. We talk about topics related to injustice and some bigger topics like theodicy and anthropocentrism and justification through Christ. James is just such a brilliant guy, and he offers insightful assessments on how constructing our worldly identity around our accomplishments and connections and character inevitably leads to suffering for us, whereas rooting our identity in our status as a redeemed child of God provides peace amidst the many storms of life. So I'm going to be quiet now and let's just get into the episode. So here is my conversation with Pastor James Hein in episode 22, The Problem of Suffering. James, welcome back to the Well Mind podcast. It's fantastic to be able to visit with you today. I think this is one of the selfish reasons why I do this podcast, is just so that I can make scheduled time to sit down and chat with people that I really enjoy talking to. So thanks for coming back on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I certainly enjoyed it last time, and looking forward to it again.
Yeah. So for those of you that are listening that haven't heard James's first episode, that was early on in the podcast, episode 3, actually. So I definitely encourage listeners to go back either before this or after listening to this one to hear our conversation on cultivating spiritual wellness. And I think kind of our discussion today will in some ways be an extension of that. We're going to cover some important topics, I think, related to particularly the issue of suffering and the problem of suffering, and how in our Christian life we deal with that, address it, and I think that absolutely suffering is an aspect of our spiritual wellness as well, because we can't avoid it. It's a reality. So before we dive into that, though, it's because it's been a little while, James, I'd just love to hear some updates on how you've been doing, how the family is, what's going on in ministry. Just, dive into some of that.
Thanks. Yeah, ministry stuff's going really well. The one of the kind of mantras that I heard at the beginning of the pandemic was that in crises, you should look at it as what's now possible versus what's not. What can't we do? So what is now possible that we maybe never would have tried prior to this? And for us congregationally, what it meant was a lot of the digital communication piece, just like you and I are talking right now. And we had such a good response to that in so many different ways that we are just pushing. We just had a strategic planning meeting the other day with our leadership, and we're just pushing further into like bringing on a new full-time position and videography and production management and that kind of stuff. And it's just like, it's gone so well and the Lord has blessed it, and, undeservedly, but it's one thing that we probably wouldn't have done pre-pandemic or thought to do, but the response has been good enough that we're going that direction. We also, it gives us an opportunity where we have this huge kind of extension to our ministry. A lot of Lutheran ministries have churches and schools, and that's kind of, there's a long and obvious kind of history between that church school relationship. We have big plans to start up now kind of a third leg to that stool, which is, we're just calling it community engagement right now, but we've been trying to do community engagement through church, and we've been trying to do some community engagement through school, but actually having a budget for it and staff for it, and for that matter, now being able to broadcast that message more publicly via our digital communications. It's just like the opportunity has been the responses to it so far have been so good that I don't know that I've ever done anything in ministry that you get that much of a sense of affirmation from God's people in doing it. Like, this is a good direction. So community engagement is a big piece to what we're doing. And then the last thing for me personally, my wife, I've been praying all day. My wife has a big test today she's studying for her doctorate in nursing anesthesia. And she has this is the test before the boards at the end of the program that she's got to take. So we're praying that gets passed today, and then we're going to celebrate tonight. Hopefully. I haven't gotten the results back yet, or the information back yet, but
yeah, is that an exam where she will get that feedback right away?
She will. Yeah,
okay.
She will. And this is, again, one that she has to pass this before she can take the boards and yada, yada. But it's been one of those study 200 hours in the last 2 months on top of clinicals kind of thing. So,
wow.
But, I've been proud of her for working hard, and that's, you're faithful with what you can be, and then you leave the results up to the Lord, and yeah, so we're excited about it.
Well, it sounds like she's certainly put in the time and the effort and the focus. And so it's just, praising God for the blessings of having that opportunity, right?
Which in the grand scheme of human wellness, that is a huge concept, controlling what you can control or influencing what you can control, and then letting go of all the variables that you can't control. And just, so not trying to control outcomes, but trying to faithfully manage what you have is been our attitude through the whole thing. And
and that's a theme that has been reoccurrent in my conversations with plenty of folks over the life of the Well Mind podcast, that it's about input. It's you can't control the outcome, and so being faithful to that, kind of staying in your day, focusing on what's in front of you. Absolutely. That, I would say that's probably in the top 3 recurring themes in my conversations with people. So that's good stuff.
Yep.
I'm curious why you paused for a second and reworded what you said, because you said control what you can control, but then you stepped back and said, no, influence what you can control. What distinction are you trying to make there, James?
Yeah, I think the idea of control itself is a little bit of delusion. So even if we think, so I think you can always tell what a culture believes largely by what you teach to kids. And we always, one of the American tropes for child rearing is you can be anything you want to be if you just put your mind to it, and it sounds great. And there's an element of truth to it, but it's patently not true. So again, I always say, if I wanted to play in the NBA today or the NFL today, it's not going to happen. I'm almost 40. My body's broken down. It can't happen, Yeah. So just to say, if I believe in it, or even if I work hard at it, or I put my mind to it, it's still not going to happen. It's logically not possible that every child in America could be the president of the United States at the same time. It's mathematically impossible. So, but nonetheless, we kind of imbibe that, and we believe it in part because we want to believe it. Mm-hmm. My future is whatever I make of it. Now, that's number one, it's an extraordinary amount of pressure, because that means that whatever I become is entirely the result of my it's under my control. So my entire destiny is what I shape of it.
Mhm.
And the more I start to learn myself and how selfish I am and how many mistakes that I make, like that's a scary thing. The idea that my future rests entirely on my goodness and my efforts. So, I mean, what I do is I think shrinking it down to understanding what we manage versus what we are actually in control of. Like the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. He's in control. He's sovereign, but he gives us these little, the talents to manage along the way. And we're not supposed to bury them. We're supposed to invest them and be faithful with them. But when you look at life as talent management rather than talent ownership, I think that's liberating, and it's also humbling. So it gives you more confidence and it makes you more humble at the same time.
Yeah. Being able to, I guess, rather than just kind of take 100% ownership for something, that you recognize that there's always more to the story.
Yeah.
And you brought up parenting, and something that I've said time and time again. Parents get too much credit when their kids are doing well, and they get too much blame when their kids are doing poorly.
Yep.
And that's, I think, kind of speaks to what you're saying here, is that as parents, of course, we can influence and at different times and different points and within certain contexts, like exercise a high level of influence.
Yep.
But it's never a control situation. And that's usually when things go off the rails, is when we're focused on control when
Correct.
it comes to parenting.
Yep. Yeah. I've, counseled both parents whose kids, like you said, maybe went off the rails, or, I mean, the big one for me would be an adult Christian whose child grew up and wandered from faith. And then it's either the issue, like, what didn't I do? Where did I go wrong? And it's like, well, maybe you didn't go wrong anywhere, because God hasn't called you to jackhammer faith into your child. God has called you to be faithful in introducing your child to Scripture and to Christ. On the other hand, there's other parents who, might have an attitude of like, well, it's my child's job to figure out their faith, that life. And it's like, no, you have a responsibility to manage what you're capable of influencing. Even though you can't control it, you can certainly influence it, and God has called you to influence it. So you don't want to give yourself less responsibility than what God gives you, but you also don't want to absorb a responsibility that only the Spirit of God actually possesses.
Yeah.
It's a balance in between there.
Well, and that's a great jumping off point for one of the topics that we were kind of thinking about chatting about, and that's issues of guilt and shame as a source of suffering in our life. And so I think about the parent that faithful in bringing up their child in God's word, making Scripture a part of family life, a part of worship life, all of that. But yet, as an adult child, they are making decisions that carry them away from the church or away from God's word or a connection with Christ, and what the impact of that is for that parent in terms of that guilt, and maybe even to an extent a sense of shame, like, oh, I'm a bad parent, or I'm no good. Right.
Yep.
And so then, you are kind of approaching that from saying, well, let's look at the evidence. It sounds like, like let's look at what actually happened as you were raising this child, and what responsibility you bear, but then what, in some cases, or in many cases, what responsibility that individual person bears as well.
Yeah. I think for some parents, and I think you phrased it really well, that they are crushed in part, and it's mixed, it's multifaceted. They're crushed because they're care about their child, and they are afraid this will now mean bad things for their child. But they're also a little bit crushed because their part of their identity was wrapped up in perceiving themselves as a loving parent. And if they feel like they've failed as a parent, it's just absolutely crushing to their self-perception, and for some of us, getting let go from a job would actually crush our self-perception. For others, it's like, well, it's just a job, it's just a paycheck. It's just, for some of us, having our kids reject us or having our kids fail, whether they're young or adults at this point, it's kind of like, for some, it's just absolutely crushing. And it gets down to this issue of, I think shame and guilt are oftentimes a failure to, or a assuming that you are not what you actually are supposed to be. And that's where the Christian advantage of figuring out where our actual identity comes from helps eliminate some of that shame in the whole concept. Because if my primary identity is a redeemed child of God, no mistake I make can take that away. No failure, whether it's moral or career oriented or relational, no failure can jeopardize the status of being a redeemed child. So it gives you emotional wellness by making sure your identity is rooted in the right spot as a Christian.
Yeah, that's that's a topic that we can unpack a bit here too, I think, because identity as a redeemed child of God, that's a foreign or alien identity. That's not something that we come into this world
Right.
automatically having. But I think from just a social standpoint or a cultural standpoint, that's not how we think about identity.
Right.
So what's been, I don't know, just in terms of sourcing our identity, what are some of the ways in which you see that most kind of commonly happening? I think you've talked about our role, right?
Yep.
As a parent, like that,
Yep.
but then like career or achievement too.
Yeah. Yeah. I got this I was preaching a while ago, and I was trying to really zero in on how people define themselves. And the categories that I ended up landing in were accomplishments, connections, and character. So accomplishments are like my performance of what I do, essentially. And that could be get into a certain school, that could mean getting certain grades in a certain school, that could mean graduating from a certain school or getting a certain job, that could mean doing well in sports or academics or music or getting a promotion. But it's my performance kind of thing. The second category, connections, is like, who am I connected to? Who do I know? What crowd do I run in? Am I on the inner circle of people that society respect? And that's, getting into a certain school sometimes is as much about that as anything. Like, who do I know? When people name drop, it's always a connection kind of thing. Or who am I the son or daughter of, sort of thing. And then the last one would be character, which is the kind of traditional religious identifying mark of, am I at least morally superior, relatively speaking, than the general population? And who am I? Well, I'm a good person. I'm a basically good person. Well, why are you basically good? Because I'm not nearly as bad as 80-90% of the rest of the people out there, kind of thing. And what's interesting too, is you can not only do, I mentioned what we teach our kids indicates what we believe. The language that we use and how we name ourselves is fascinating to me too. So if you look at where, like, the history of English names, so some of the most common names, like, rank in the top 10: Smith, Baker, Miller. Those are all professions. Those are their person was so enmeshed with what they did in life that everybody just started calling that person Joe Smith, because he's the Smith, or Joe Baker because he's the baker in town. And so, like, our last names, our surnames are related, many of them, to what we do. Many of them are also related to the connections that we have in life. So where do all the names like Jackson, Johnson, Thompson come from? Well, because that person was the son of Jack, or the son of John, or the son of Tom, kind of thing. And so, and there's character ones like this too. But my point is, even the way we structure our naming systems in society fall into these categories of accomplishments, connections, or character. And this is not certainly a new thing. The Jews of the New Testament are constantly, in the entire book of Romans, the Apostle Paul is trying to tell Jewish converts to Christianity, your salvation does not rest in your pedigree or your moral performance. The fact that you're ancestors of Abraham, or the fact that you've kept the Mosaic laws better than the other nations. At least the first 4 chapters of Romans are essentially about that. That's not your identity. Your identity is this foreign this otherworldly grace, a righteousness that comes apart from works of the law. It's the grace of God, and it's, you mentioned it being foreign. We're adopted into God's family in our baptisms. But we're naturally looking to find our identity in our accomplishments, connections, or character.
Yeah, and I don't think that stops even when we are in that affirmed status as a redeemed child of God. That doesn't
Correct.
mean that these other aspects of striving for identity fall away. And I think, I mean, it would seem to me that those would be sources of suffering in this life when we're trying to control or manufacture our identity in one of those kind of three earthly areas.
Yeah, well, they're all going to fail you eventually. Like, so you're going to, if your identity is in your career and your performance, at some point in time, you better retire. And if you don't, it's going to get embarrassing because you're going to start performing poorly and staying long past your, it's the professional athlete that won't hang it up or whatever. And it just becomes like an embarrassment of their career kind of thing. Or if your identity is in your relationships, if you're fortunate enough to live long enough, you're going to bury every other person who's currently sitting around your dinner table. Like, relationships in this lifetime end in death. And so the point is, any one of those identities is going to fail you. You're going to sin, your character will fail you. You're going to lose connections, they will fail you. You're going to stop making as many accomplishments, they will fail you. So what could you root? It seems like the most stabilizing thing emotionally, psychologically, would be to root yourself in something that nobody could ever possibly take away from you, and you can't possibly screw up yourself,
Yeah. Well, that at least ended on a high note, because I was feeling kind of bummed out there about.
I have that wet blanket tendency. Yeah. No,
everybody's gonna die. I'm gonna screw it up, and I'm gonna embarrass myself.
Yeah, I think so. The hope is, like, the Christian hope is not that bad things don't happen. It's that you have the resources to navigate any bad things that do happen.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. It doesn't matter. And then it would be like, what if you could do life pressure free? Again, from a wellness standpoint, wouldn't that be great if like you could work just because it's using your talents and it's serving other human beings. It's not making a name for myself kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's really stepping out of our own ego, I think. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a striving for a title. There's a striving for accolades, these kind of external affirmations. And so would you say that that's incorrect? Like that's maybe even like wrong to be motivated to kind of drive toward those things?
Yeah. So I don't think it's neither inherently right or wrong. It's a matter of like primacy in our lives. So the first commandment, the idea, you shall have no other gods before me, that phrase "before me" or "besides me" suggests to me that idolatry isn't the concept, again, of loving bad things. It's the problem of loving things with primacy ahead of God. And so if we love God first, then we absolutely can still have a competitive edge. We can absolutely still, but we're doing it for different reasons. So I want to be the best in, my field at one thing, not because I want to be better than other people, but because I want to faithfully manage the talents that I've been given and serve other people really well with those talents. It's still motivational, but it's not I don't need it. And I think when you get to the point of needing something that you technically don't need, I think you get desperate, which makes you, again, psychologically unwell. I also think that when you need it, what you start to do is anything or anyone that stands in the way of you attaining it becomes just an obstacle, and you're willing to run them over. And so then it becomes not just about me, it becomes about social discord, these other humans are just obstacles that stand in the way of the thing that I need to have in order to feel okay about myself.
Yeah. How do you, I mean, how do you make that flip
Mm-hmm.
from, this kind of having maybe achievement, or to use your word, accomplishment,
Yeah.
as a primary driver for me, for how I make my decisions, or how my sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
How do you begin to make that flip
Mm-hmm.
toward allowing God to be that primary spot in your life, and realigning your motivations as you're talking about here?
Yeah, even that, I'm not sure to what extent you can control it. I think one of the ways it happens is when oftentimes if you get that thing that you're driving for and it almost kind of disappoints you. Like let's say you get a promotion and you realize, or you get a, perfect report card, or and you realize it just doesn't solve all the problems in life. A lot of people are stressing to get the promotion at work. They're stressing to make more money. They're, stressing to pay off all their debt. And these are like, they're good things in and of themselves, but it doesn't make all of life doesn't happily end in those moments. So you realize that a good thing is not an ultimate thing. And I think that there's some kind of realization that comes with experience. And one of the reasons why so many people are striving desperately to get to these things is they haven't reached them yet. Once they get them, it's like, they realize how kind of shallow it actually is, and what in life actually matters. So, how do we make our motivations better? I don't know. I think the Holy Spirit ultimately sanctifies our motivations in the sense that we either realize we were being selfish in the past, or we realize something's not as important as we thought it was, or something along those lines.
Well, then in a way, it sounds like suffering can be that teacher.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so we, I kind of pose that, like, the problem of suffering, but
Mm-hmm.
here we're seeing a different perspective for the usefulness, I guess, of suffering.
Yeah. Suffering is it's such a great topic because, again, Christians have unique resources for dealing with suffering in the same way that, in identity, it's not that Christians don't struggle with false identity. It's that we have unique resources for overcoming a shaky and unstable identity. Christians suffer as much as anybody else, but we have unique resources for dealing with suffering. And one of the things that I'd say on the topic of like theodicy, or the problem of reconciling the idea of a loving God with the suffering that we face in the world, is one line that I heard once was, suffering is a problem for Christians, but it's just as much a bigger problem for non-believers. And what the author was trying to state by that is, like, yes, is it difficult to reconcile the idea God loves me and yet he allows incredible pain in my life? Yep, that's difficult. It's in the same way that, like, a child understanding why a parent disciplines them is difficult. Like, I don't know that a child, by nature of being what they are, can comprehend the nature of discipline, the reasons of discipline. But it's actually a bigger problem for the non-believer, because if suffering is meaningless, like if it accomplishes nothing, then it really is depressing, because you're not only is the pain itself painful, but the purposelessness of it is like doubly painful. And in fact, I don't know if you ever heard of Charles Taylor before, but he's this Canadian philosopher who wrote a really good work called The Secular Age, really big, really long, but good. And in it, he has this section called the anthropocentric turn. I got turned on to Charles Taylor from Tim Keller. The anthropocentric turn
Yeah,
is,
no, I was gonna.
if you
don't
unpack
have
that,
to spell it. Yeah, that's
yeah,
okay.
it basically, what he was saying is, so it's anthropocentric means human-centered. And
Yeah.
what they were saying is, before the age of enlightenment, human beings were essentially functionally God-centered. And even if you weren't like Christian, although, many were, but you had some conception of appeasing or pleasing or living for the gods, right? And so it wasn't about you. It was about your wellness was dependent on a life that was of a life that belonged to God or the gods. But in the kind of the rationalism of the Enlightenment era, humans tried to get away from beliefs and faith and religion as much as possible, at least in the public sphere, and said, okay, let's just look at empirical data. And essentially in the modern Western world, what you had was this thing, again, a human turn, an anthropocentric turn. The meaning of life is not to glorify God. The meaning of life is to take care of the self, the human self. And what that then becomes is like, if the meaning of life is to glorify God, then suffering can be advantageous because you might sacrifice yourself for others for the purpose of glorifying your God. Like if you run into a burning building and save a bunch of people, yes, it ends your life and there would be a ton of pain attached to it, but you accomplished that goal of glorifying God and helping others in the world. On the other hand, in the anthropocentric turn, essentially what we had is humans said, the goal of life is my pleasure, my comfort, my happiness. Because if we came from nothing, and if when we die, we go into the ground and it doesn't matter and it doesn't mean anything. And if the sun is running out of energy in a couple billion years from now, it goes away and everything that ever happened here on earth will be forgotten, then what difference does any of it make? That doesn't make any difference. So the goal then is this Epicurean idea of squeeze as much out of this life, seize the day kind of moment, and squeeze as much joy, comfort, pleasure out of today as you can. But what if suffering comes? Like if the goal of life, if the meaning of life is to accomplish as much joy as possible, but something beyond your control comes in, like a cancer or whatever, and a tragedy strikes and it shuts down your capacity for as much joy, then it's doubly painful because not only has you're physically experiencing some pain, but now your whole sense of purpose of life is completely crushed. On the other hand, to be able to have pain in your life, but to say, I can glorify God from the middle of this storm, that adding meaning to it and purpose to it, and actually realizing that I can become even more refined. And sometimes actually, my suffering is an opportunity by where God holds a microphone up to my mouth so that the world can, if my part of my goal is to go to the ends of the earth and proclaim the goodness of God, suffering sometimes gives me a platform to do that. That's, comfortable life just doesn't. So I can actually glorify God arguably more being calm in the midst of the storm than avoiding the storm altogether.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So much good stuff there, James. I really appreciate you unpacking that. A thought came into my mind as you were talking, because we've been using the word suffering, but pain is kind of creeping in there too.
Yeah.
And there's a statement that I've heard, and I mean, I don't know, it feels a little bit like a platitude at times, but the statement is that you can't avoid pain, but pain is part of life, but you don't have to suffer. That suffering is like this kind of prolonged something in a way that we're doing to ourselves. And so like, oh, there's the pain of loss of a job, or there's the pain of losing a loved one, or the natural disaster, whatever. There's that pain, but then how we handle that or respond to it then determines whether or not we move into a pattern of suffering, or some other direction. And I guess I'm just kind of wondering, does that match up with the way you think about things, or is there a different perspective than that?
I guess I don't know
that before.
I have not.
Yeah, that you don't have that you can't avoid pain, but you can avoid suffering.
I think so. Pain strikes me as having a little bit more of a sensory connotation to it, and suffering is more, there's a psychological and like there's a deeper element to it. And so, for instance, if I can I reconcile that definition with like what Job goes through? Would I say that Job was just in pain, but he had the option to not suffer? I don't think I can say that.
No, yeah, yeah,
So to me, the definition itself sort of falls apart, even though I understand, I think the distinction that they're trying to make. But no, I think suffering, I think pain is inevitable, and suffering is the deeper levels of pain, not just more intense pain, but a more like holistic, it's conception of pain, deeper in that way. And I think that's an inevitable part of life.
right. Because I think pain is located to a specific like incident or a context or an event or something, that there's pain involved in that. But then, yeah, suffering is something that can happen kind of as a result of that pain. But I appreciate what you said about it being deeper, because what the things that we're talking about here, like our meaning and purpose and our identity and our relationships, and that like those are primary in our life. Those are really, really important to just about everybody. So when we're impacted on those levels, to me it seems like, well, yeah, suffering is going to be there.
Yeah. Yeah. A simple distinction, I would say, or analogy, I would say the relationship between happiness and joy, I might say, is equivalent to the relationship between pain and suffering. It's a deeper, more profound
Mm-hmm.
aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. So I'd shared this with you too, when we were chatting, but there was a New York Times article that was published recently, and it was on the topic of languishing. And I don't think that's a word that we use very often. I can't remember the last time that I talked to somebody and I asked, "Hey, how you doing?" And they're like, "I'm languishing," But
Right. Yeah.
but it is I think a descriptive word, especially in the context of this article. And I'll link that in the show notes so people can check it out, because it's not long and I think it's well written. But it's like this definition of languishing is the absence of wellness without the dysfunction of illness.
Mm.
And so we're looking at the continuum of our health and well-being, and oftentimes I think we're putting suffering kind of out towards the end of being like unwell, right? And
Yep.
languishing is like kind of walking back from that, but we're not well. So they use words in the article like experiencing a malaise or feeling burned out, foggy,
Yep.
lethargic, hazy, those kind of things. But to me, that languishing experience is really still, it's like a lower level, but just as insidious
Mm-hmm.
as the suffering that we're talking about, because it's like I think of all the shoulds that would
Mm-hmm.
happen for somebody that's languishing. Like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
in this job, I have a job, I should be happy.
Yeah.
There's so many people that don't have a job
Right.
or aren't able to pay their bills, but yet I'm not experiencing joy and happiness at any level.
Yep.
So I guess I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are from a spiritual perspective on the issue of languishing.
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, it's a really, every once in a while you hear a word that like just summarizes. I mean, that's the cool thing about language is a billion different ideas can be packed into like 8 letters. And languishing is one that, I think is probably a good synopsis of what humans have been going through during a pandemic. And again, I think especially humans in the Western world. So I think other portions of the country and certainly different eras in history, people were just better at suffering, to put it bluntly. Like because modern Western people, i.e., like modern Americans, think the purpose of life is prosperity, comfort, and flourishing. The moment that gets jeopardized and the moment there's something that stands in the way of me experiencing that to the fullness, I assume something's wrong. And not only that, we're a highly litigious society that we would assume we should sue somebody else, because they stand in the way of my comfort,
Yeah.
pleasure, and happiness.
Yeah.
And it's just this really, we don't realize that, like, nope, the earth is not a blank slate. It's not neutral. It's a fallen existence.
Yeah.
And we should anticipate suffering. Anybody who's not anticipating that is not like fully thinking. I mean, there's an overly pessimistic whatever, but the flip side of that is a naivety by which we assume things should go well for me. Everything should be great and whatever. And so you get to a period like a pandemic, and I think I've usually categorized people, if you're on a 0 to 10, continuum, almost everybody's doing 2 points lower than what they would otherwise be. Now, that means that those of us with some mental health pre-existing disorders or conditions, maybe we're generally floating around about a 3 or 4, but now we're at like a 1 or 2. So it's really intense. But everybody, even if you're like a normal person, normal as in the average, you know what I mean?
Your average level of functioning. Yeah.
Average level. Yeah. If you're, a 5 or 6, you're still right now you're at like a 3 or 4. And what that means is that, like you're just doing worse, and you don't see an end to doing worse. There's been nobody seems to know, like, what your government officials, the CDC, and it's like, well, what if this is a new normal? And what if this is and people hate even using terms like that. And so everybody's on edge because of the uncertainty attached to it. And again, what I would say is, if the goal of life is comfort, then a pandemic, a global pandemic that you cannot control, it feels pretty helpless. If the goal of life is to glorify God despite the circumstances, not only can you continue to keep your meaning and purpose in life, but you arguably can do it to better degrees in the midst. So like light is more obvious the darker circumstances get. And I think this is true even parenting literature and stuff too. Like, there's been an interesting push from what I can tell, in parenting literature in the past 10 years, after the phenomenon of like helicopter parenting, that kind of thing. This swing to us saying, okay, the goal is not to bubble wrap your kids and help them avoid all possible dangers, because what that creates is naive, weak children. While you don't want them to experience oppressive or unnaturally harsh
no
issues.
traumas,
right? Right. Yeah. Protect them from trauma. Don't protect them from everything that is wrong, wicked, evil in the world, because they actually need a coach to help guide them, build up the muscles to deal with those things. So I think it's on the brain because I'm preaching on it here in Acts 27. But the Apostle Paul in the storm, so he faces shipwreck. Again, this is Paul, who has been beaten up, stoned, has been on trial and wrongfully imprisoned for years. And he appeals to Caesar in Rome. So he's going to Rome, and why not? He has to go through an absolute shipwreck. And he's, come on, the guy can't catch a break. And part of what you learn there is God's goal for us is not to just avoid storms. And I think what we are trying to do for ourselves, what a lot of Americans are trying to do for their kids, is just avoid every storm. The goal of life is not to avoid storms. The goal is to glorify God in the middle of the storms. And in fact, there might be another 275 people on that boat that if you avoided that storm altogether, they might not get saved by your, if you weren't present, they might not get saved. So as opposed to just running away from every possible storm in life, maybe glorify God in the middle of the storm, and maybe, just maybe, he's going to use you to save a bunch of people in the process. And I think that's a totally different attitude when it comes to facing suffering and pandemic stuff and whatever. What is possible here in terms of glorifying God that isn't possible apart from this?
Yeah. It's and I appreciate that you use that word attitude as well. Because I hear and I read, oh, I'm so excited that we get to X, Y, and Z, or it's, it's coming, life is coming back soon. And,
Yeah.
we're getting to do some of these. It's like looking for, and I don't want to be, I don't want to overstate this, but it's like, but I get the sense that joy and happiness is something that it's like, that's coming. And it's
Hmm. Yeah.
when we get to do these things or experiencing these things again. And so I remain hopeful in a positive like
Yeah.
future and good things happening. And that's just in stark contrast to what you're talking about, because tomorrow is going to take care of tomorrow, because that is in God's hands. And whatever blessings are part of that are going to be fantastic and awesome. And let's celebrate that together. At the same time, I am where I am right now. And there are opportunities in this current situation, this current context, for me to be of service and experience a sense of like meaning and purpose in that.
Yeah. As somebody who, again, admittedly has struggled with anxiety and depression, when I've allowed myself to get into the framework of thinking that I will be happy once blank, and it's something like once this is done or once I've accomplished this, that is a bad place to be, man, because there's so many, you might not accomplish that. Like it's some things beyond your control. Furthermore, what you've essentially said is everything up until that point has become the absence of happiness.
Mm-hmm.
It's become just complete misery, and it just disallows you from enjoying, and for that matter, being grateful for the good things that you're getting along the way. And it's a brutal mindset. Rather, Paul's mindset, I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, is absolutely the believer's. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's what the believer has access to. That is just this otherworldly kind of gift that the rest of the world doesn't yet know. You
Mm-hmm.
can say to other people, I can't take all your problems away. I can help teach you how to be joyful, optimistic, hopeful, and content no matter what. Like, what if
Yeah.
you can't stop the bullets from flying, but what if you could wear a bulletproof vest all the time?
Mm-hmm.
Like you'd become some kind of hero. So I think this is what Christianity is affording us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that really flows out of right, the doctrine of justification,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And we look at that as an objective, in an objective sense, but that becomes subjective in faith, right?
Hmm.
So it's like it's free and it's available for everyone, right?
Hmm.
But it becomes ours through faith. So I think that for those within the Christian faith to be able to look to their neighbor and to see that turn toward that pain, turn
Hmm.
toward that suffering, um, and I think that provides an opportunity um, for sharing that unique otherworldly gift, right?
Yeah.
Um, I
Yeah.
don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I, you know, um, the idea you mentioned, justification, objective and subjective, the idea that Jesus died for all versus the fact that the Holy Spirit appropriates that specifically to us through faith. Um, that it's an important distinction, and yet again one that, so again, to me, this is just an incredible resource that Christians have, because my status, my identity, we talked about earlier, it's an adopted, redeemed child of God. I can't screw it up. None of my failures jeopardize it. And nobody can force it away from me, because it's a legal change in status. It's not a like qualitative change in character. And so it very much is like an adoption then. So like I think that illustration, when a child gets adopted, there are legal papers that are signed. And at that moment, if something would happen to, for instance, the parents, everything that legally belonged to the parents is now inherited by that legal child, because the status, legally, the courtroom status of the child has changed. On the other hand, that child, the first day that you bring them home, they might be crying all night because who are these people? And, am I sure I want to be here? And I don't know that I trust them. And so that they're not living as though they're part of the family quite yet. But from the courtroom standpoint, they're
They
absolutely
are.
part of the family.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what you have with a lot of Christians, and this is part of the sanctification process, is like starting to actually live out of my justified status. Whereas when we first enter into the kingdom and enter into the family, we're living just as much out of the flesh, And so, I mean, we mentioned that before when we were talking about identity through accomplishments, connections, and character. The difference, and you said that's a temptation for Christians too, right? Like, yeah, totally. The difference between the believer and the non-believer is not that one faces that temptation and the other doesn't. The difference between a believer and non-believer is that one is repenting of that false status and the other is not. And so the Christian is saying, like, Lord, I'm sorry not only for the bad things that I've done, because lots of religious people say that. The Christian is saying, I'm sorry that I've tried to find myself in so many other good things. I'm repenting of the Apostle Paul. He does this in Romans and Galatians. He not only repents of the bad things that he's done, he repents of his like pseudo righteousness. He says, everything that I formerly considered what I am, I now consider it rubbish, is the proper English term for it. But it's a naughtier word that he says, or a dirtier word that he says, I now consider it whatever. And he's saying, I'm disgusted by the fact that I formerly thought who I was my moral performance. I now rejoice in the fact that I despite my wretchedness, I'm a redeemed child of God. So again, I think that learning to live out of your justified status is a huge thing for wellness too.
Yeah. And that's, it's both an event, like you said, like that adoption, like that's a singular event, but then there's this lifelong process that flows out of and forward from that initial point.
Interestingly enough, and I don't know how much it's worth, or I mean, going into like a distinct Lutheran framework of thinking about this, but I've had the kind of good fortune of working with a lot of people who came from either from other Christian backgrounds. And for instance, and I think it's kind of everybody understands this caricature a little bit, but the idea of the role that works play in Roman Catholicism. And the idea that somebody who has that framework of thinking might be wondering, have I done enough good to, earn my status as God's child and a status of believer in heaven? Interestingly enough, on the other end of the spectrum, I've actually worked with as much or more people from kind of evangelical, non-denominational background. My wife is from that kind of background, but it's something that they were similar. Now, those two groups, Roman Catholics and non-denom like Pentecostals, would consider themselves complete opposites. But the non-denominational equivalent that I often hear is like, I find myself in how much faith I have. So a Roman Catholic might find themselves in their work or find their Christian status in their works. A non-denominational Christian might find themselves in how much faith, or how do I know I have enough faith to be saved? One of the phrases that my wife was a recurring one when we first started dating was, I know I'm saved, but I don't always know if they called it rapture ready. And they believed in a millennial reign of Christ, and some would be raptured and others would still be here to be purified. It's very similar to the Roman Catholic concept of purgatory. But the point is, both sides of it are essentially saying my Christian status is based on either the work that I do or the faith that I have. The Lutheran conception of that is my salvation is not at all based on either the size of my works or the number of my works or the size of my faith, because faith as small as a mustard seed can move mountains. My salvation status is entirely based on the work of Jesus Christ. And actually, like psychologically, where I get spiritually anxious is when I'm focusing on myself at all too much, when I should be focusing on Christ. So am I focusing on the bad things that I've done or the good things that I've failed to do? Am I focusing on how much faith I have, like a spiritual pride, or a lack of faith that I have? It's still focusing on me. Whereas if I can just pull myself off of myself, pull my eyes off myself and focus on Christ, justification, declared not guilty, is not the same thing as living innocent. It's a courtroom declare of not guilty. If I can just focus on Jesus who did that for me, it gets rid of so much spiritual anxiety, I might say.
Yeah. In the peace, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if we want to stay calm in the midst of a storm, if we want to be able to let light shine in darkness, if we want to be able to have contentment in all things, right? This is the peace, that assurance outside of ourself. That's a gift. That's like, I'm putting my feet on that. That's the ground that I'm going to stand on.
Yep.
No matter what. And the minute I start taking steps off and I start slipping down, it's like, oh no, refocus on that verdict, right?
A resurrected Savior cannot change. The idea that my status is safe as of 2,000 years ago, like in linear time, it's before I was born. The best thing that I could ever possibly be in this life has already been taken care of. A redeemed child of God. The best thing anybody can be for all eternity is a redeemed child of God. And nobody can take that away from me. So why do I get so upset about not achieving one thing, or somebody rejecting me, or whatever criticisms, or, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. And I don't think you've said this explicitly a little bit when you were talking about how suffering can act as a way of refining us, right? Kind of burning off some of the ego or the unnecessary worldly parts of us. But this is a way in which suffering can draw us closer to God, in that sense, that it just brings to bear how things aren't dependent on us, and it's not about what I'm doing, or how big that faith is in that moment, but that it draws us to Him, and he can call to us through suffering, and really redeem that suffering for our good.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter what kind of suffering. I mean, we could drill down deeper into different, there's various forms of suffering. And I know you and I had talked a little bit off the air about some concepts, but it's amazing to me how Christianity, again, always has specific resources for even various forms of suffering. So like one of the things that you mentioned was like injustices.
Yeah.
How does Christianity speak to that?
Right. And this kind of comes out of a perspective that that we live just a belief in a just universe, that things are gonna work out for good. And there's even kind of, that gets, I think, misapplied from a Christian perspective, like, all things are going to work out for good. And that kind of reinforces this justice perspective. But then when we experience injustice, and even when whole peoples are experiencing injustices over and over and over, that creates this dissonance, which brings about suffering and anger and frustration.
Yeah, there's a Croatian theologian by the name of Miroslav Volf who wrote this like kind of classic work called Exclusion and Embrace. And there's a spot in it where he's got this great line about how the idea of a loving God would never send anybody to hell, or a loving God would never X, Y, or Z, which is something you hear a lot, or at least I hear a lot as a pastor from the American mindset. He says that idea is completely born out of the comfort of a suburban American home. And what he means by that is, if you think that, so like he's saying during different experiences that he's had in Eastern Europe, where you'll have like constant warring and the murders and raping of family members and like that kind of intense level stuff. If you tell that person there is never any justice for those families, so and so could have just gotten away with it and that's it. There's never any punishment for it. The law didn't get them, and they got away with it. If that makes them more angry about God than the idea that a God could punish and does punish sin. And so the idea, the basic idea, I think for Christians, then is we all sense. This has a line in Mere Christianity where he talks about if anybody who's like a relativist that doesn't think right and wrong are true, just cut in front of line in them, cut in front of the line in front of them, and ask if they get offended by it. Like, of course they will. If you punch somebody in the face, they're going to get offended. Why? Because it's wrong. Well, why is it wrong? According to Darwinian theory, it's not wrong. It's survival of the fittest. It's the propagation of the species. It's like, so you can not like it, but you can't say it's wrong. So if you sense that it's wrong, if you sense morality, if you sense justice, that points to a divine being who programmed right and wrong and morality into the universe. So how do you deal with the fact that there are so many injustices that go on all the time? To me, the Christian doctrine of Judgment Day has been so liberating. The idea that at the end of time, either somebody has repented sincerely of what they've done and recognized, I've hurt people, I've been selfish, and I'm very, very sorry for that, or they answer to God for it. Now, most of the people who have been injusticed, what they usually want is simply for somebody to acknowledge sorrow over what they've done. Even if they realize like you can't bring so-and-so back or you can't whatever. A lot of times it's just like, if the person was sincerely repentant over what they've done, they would feel more capacity to forgive. But again, it means that I don't personally have to repay evil with evil if I understand that at the end of time, all the wrongs will be righted by a divine judge who has said, either I've taken the ultimate punishment for you. Either you confess your sins, turn to me, find forgiveness and new life, or you're saying you don't want me and you want to deal with whatever justice is going to take place. But the point is, nobody gets away with anything. And if I can actually believe, okay, there's injustice in the world, but nobody's getting away with it. My God has said nobody gets away with it. My God is gracious, he's fair, he's forgiving, but he is just. And that it allows me to let go of some of the things that, I can't control, and my fears about somebody getting away with something.
Yeah. Well said. I appreciate that. Those insights as well. And it's, it offers comfort, and at the same time, there's a sense of conviction in it too, right?
Yep.
Because we know that if that applies to everyone out there, that I maybe am like focused on for injustice, that also applies to me too, right?
Yep.
So that it's like this double-edged sword of like both comfort and conviction.
Yeah. Yep. Right. And again, I don't see any of that as just because God is going to right the wrongs at the end of time. I don't see that as an excuse to not fight for justice right now. I think that absolutely is a thing that Christians have a responsibility to hold accountable the various leaders of the establishments that God puts in place, whether it's spiritual leaders like pastors or if it's civic leaders. Like we have a responsibility to hold them accountable too. But we're fighting for justice, understanding that at the end of time, God he guarantees justice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good stuff. Well, I know we're getting close to the end of our time that we had set aside for today. So I just really appreciate, James, our time together and being able to visit with you, and the perspective that you're able to give voice to during these conversations. Your repeated phrase about the Christian having access to, through faith, to these truths that bring peace, that bring strength, that bring a patient endurance when suffering happens, and see that as an opportunity, and And you really, even before we embarked on this journey of talking about it, like you were exemplifying that attitude right as you were giving me your update, right?
Mhm.
Because you were talking about how the pandemic created so many like limitations for community engagement for you and your ministry there in Milwaukee, and but yet it's been, well, what opportunities does this afford us to grow and to improve and to connect with our community in a new and an impactful, right, efficacious kind of way. So I love that this isn't just something that we're talking about, but it's something that you're actively doing, and I hope that listeners are able to incorporate and integrate this mindset into their day-to-day life too. And um, so I'm always I'll link some of the books that you referenced, contemporary and classic. But if somebody's really interested in kind of extending their understanding or growing in some of these areas about theodicy, about understanding justification, about our identity in Christ, what kind of resources would you direct them toward?
My favorite. So I think I maybe mentioned last time that my favorite author is Dr. Tim Keller, who has written a couple New York Times bestsellers, but he's got one work called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, which is maybe my favorite book. I mean, it's the book that I tend to gift to people in, really difficult circumstances. Philip Yancey has a lot of good works to like Disappointment with God and Where is God When It Hurts. There's a couple works. He's the former, I think, editor at Christianity Today, but has some really good stuff. But Keller's Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering is the first thing that I steer people to. It's just so deep and so good.
All right, you heard it here. Get it on your shelf
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
tomorrow for sure. Awesome. So I know you're again really active in growth with this community engagement and ministry, and certainly prayerful that all things work out for your wife with her exam.
Thank you.
But what else do you have coming up on the horizon that you're thinking about, that you're working on?
Um, that's about it. I keep plugging away and keep your head down and keep rolling. And God, honestly, I have certain things that I'm like, we really should have a program for this, and we really should have a program for that. And this constant feeling of a little bit of failure and whatever. And programs aren't the be all end all of everything, but every day. I mean, I truly try to practice what I preach on this stuff. Every day I wake up feeling like I'm not enough and I don't have enough in and of myself to accomplish what's before me. And yet I realize the resources that I do have in Christ and realize how undeservedly blessed I am. So, I mean, the community engagement piece is the biggest lift, biggest ministry lift. If you just looked at it like a church is a big thing, a school is a big thing. And then what if you were trying to spin and lift one more big thing?
Mm-hmm.
That's where it's at right now. But the capacity to I remember hearing somebody put it once as, if your church would disappear, would the neighbors in your neighborhood shed any tears? And the idea that God's people, and just the history of the Christian church too, they were such a force for good during the times of the plagues and otherwise. But the idea that Christians accomplish so much objective good that even the people who don't necessarily believe what they believe would weep if they disappeared one day. And I think community type of work is the type of thing that creates great relationships and gives us an opportunity to, speak up and take leadership during the storms of life.
Cool. Good stuff. James, thanks again. It's been a great chat and visit. Look forward to a time when we can do this again.
Yeah. Thanks. Right. Keep up the great work. I appreciate it.
Thanks, man. Take care.
You too.
A big thank you to James for being a member of the Well Mind community, and thanks to you for spending your time with me today. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe through your podcast app so that you automatically get the latest episode. New episodes are released the first and third Monday of each month. Also, consider taking a moment to review the show if you found our discussion meaningful to you. Word of mouth is great too. Please tell people about the Well Mind podcast and spread the word. Please check out the links in the show notes for the various books and articles referenced in our conversation today as well. And remember, submit your wellness questions for an upcoming Q&A episode. You can send those to me at thewellmind@blc.edu. You can also find that email address in the show notes for this episode. Many thanks to the staff here in the Bethany Lutheran College podcast studio. Seth and Greg are tremendous in providing technical support and editing for the podcast. Special thanks as always to Lauren McMacken for designing the logo and the cover art. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, be well.